Hi there. So we're going to continue to talk about cycles and a little bit more in depth about what cycles really are, and do we have an idea as to how to forecast the future based upon cycles. Well, what most people think of as a cycle is some sort of a sine wave or a loop-de-loop-de-loop-de-loop kind of thing where there's a low and it goes up and there's a high and then it goes up and it goes down and then there's another low, and then so maybe every 20 days there's a low, and every 20 days halfway in between those two lows is a high, this kind of thing in terms of the way the cycle is structured. But that's a simplistic understanding which isn't necessarily completely correct. There's a thing called the law of periodicity. And the law of periodicity is basically a more holistic understanding of the structure of history repeats itself. The concept that history repeats itself. What I'm going to get at right now is why is it that history repeats itself, and how do we know when history is going to continue to repeat and when all of a sudden it seems to stop repeating? Those are critical ingredients of anybody who's studying cycles, and particularly someone who's in the stock market or in the markets and the economic environment. They're trying to figure out when inflation will continue, when it'll stop, when interest rates will go up and down and such. So the reality of it is the law of periodicity basically states that there is an interval of time, and at that interval of time, a sequence of activities, a sequence of events will take place along that path until that time interval begins again. So if you think of it as a circle with a bunch of knots in it, or a rope with a bunch of knots in it, that not only is the beginning point and the end point, the low to the low, going to tend to repeat, but all the intermediate knots along the way, all the different events along the way, also will have correlates that are similar along that path. And this law of periodicity actually gives you tremendous power in terms of forecasting. Because you take a look at, let's say, a 49-week cycle in the stock market, which is there, and you can look at it, and the point is, where do you start? Well, the point is you can start from anywhere. Wherever you start 49 weeks earlier, the same set of conditions, the same relationship that created the events of the present are located at 49 weeks back to a certain extent. And if you go back another 49 weeks, there's also that set of laws of nature, that set of influences are also there to a certain extent, okay? And also, if you go back a certain number of repetitions, you'll find that the repetition is even more accurate. So an example of this is the Jupiter and Saturn synodic cycle. Synodic cycle simply means that the planets come together and then they move away from each other as time goes on, and then eventually they come back together again. So when they're conjunct and when they're together and then they separate and one moves faster than the other, eventually comes back to the slower moving one, that time frame from togetherness to togetherness is called the synodic cycle. And for Jupiter, it's a 20-year interval of time. And every 20 years, there's some similarity, okay? But the location in the zodiac where the conjunctions are taking place, if, for example, in 2001, they were together in the sign of Aries, okay? And if you go back to the prior iteration in 1980, they were together in the sign of Virgo. If you go back another 20 years, they were together in the sign of Capricorn, like that. So if you go back 60 years, 3 times 20, 3 of these repetitions, 3 of these synodic cycles of Jupiter and Saturn, not only do you get a repetition of the events that are similar, but the sign placement of 60 years ago is the same. The conjunction in Capricorn in 1962 just happened again in 2021, okay? So the 60-year cycle is actually more similarness. If you look at a 60-year interval, you'll find the events of 60 years ago are more similar in many ways than the events of 20 years ago and 40 years ago, even though those also had some value of similarity. But the location in the heavens, the location in the zodiac was different. So this concept of using synodic cycles and looking at the repetition of history in an actual sequential continuum This is not generally thought of in cycle work, and it actually is quite real. So if you look at 1962 and 2021, 22, you'll find a very, very similar set of influences. If you look at 1963, you'll find some of those same things in 2023. Won't be identical, but they'll be very, very close. For example, the same combination of cycles for 3 cycles, where you have the north node or the south node of the moon conjunct with Jupiter and Saturn. This is a very rare combination. It roughly happens every 40 years. The conjunction in the same sign doesn't happen except every 2064 years. So if you look 2064 years, you have a set of conditions reoccurring where the 3 planets are together, and they're together in the same part of the zodiac, and they haven't had that event, hasn't been as closely, they haven't been that close together in the same place for 2,000 years. So if you look at 2064 years ago, and the 1/3 points, for example, 1/3 of that is 688 years ago. Guess what happened 688 years ago, which is the 1/3, the sameness point of the 2,000-year cycle. In 1331, was the start of the Black Plague. In 2019, 688 years later, we started this pandemic that's been worldwide, and it's been horrendous, and hopefully it's soon over. But guess where the Black Plague began in 1331? It started in Wuhan, China. It started in Wuhan, China. It started in the same place that this pandemic seems to have emerged from. Think of the odds of that. Not only is the event similar, but the location of the event's beginning is similar. I have no issue with the fact that it came from China or anywhere else. I'm just looking at history. And for as a matter of fact, the 1918 flu pandemic may have started in Kansas. There's a strong possibility, but that's not for sure. But it's a good chance it started in the United States. So no particular bias in either direction. But this is the way the history is actually being created. If you start looking at very large cycles in history, and you begin to look with a very easygoing kind of mindset where you can accept similarity if it isn't identical, but it's close, you'll begin to see events taking place which are absolutely remarkable. On that note, I want you to understand that there's a concept of fractal geometry. Fractal geometry means that the seed of anything, the seed of an apple, the genetics of the thing is built in this tiny little modality called the seed. And as the seed unfolds itself and sprouts and grows, you eventually get an apple. And from an apple seed, you get an apple tree, and then you get more apples off of that. So the codon of the secret inner core of the DNA of the thing that's determining its existence is tiny. And then it gets bigger, and eventually it becomes a full tree, and then it eventually sprouts and gives birth to another iteration, another generation of itself. This concept of a fractal is also in the market. So we were talking about a cycle of 240 years, and there are subcycles that are smaller. It turns out that there are many, many cycles that are of similar length. For example, there's a 4-year cycle in nature. It's generated by the relationship between the Sun, Moon, Rahu, and Ketu. And there's also a 4-month cycle generated by the Sun and the Moon also. The new moon, every 4th new moon, there's some similarity in terms of behavior. And there's a 4-day cycle. And it turns out there's also a 4-minute cycle. So what happens in nature is that some of the cycles grow. They go from smaller to huger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And they're all related to each other in form. The small seed becomes the big thing, but it's the big thing and it has the same form, the same shape. The conditions, the predisposition, the elements that are involved in the initial DNA, they combine in such a way as to create the same thing on a bigger scale. So cycles have, on the one side, they're generated in a sequence of events. They're generated by a repetition, the law of periodicity, And the other principle which we're going to talk about is the concept of fractals growing, cycles growing. And the growth pattern of cycles is not just one growth pattern. There are many. One of the most common ones is the Fibonacci series and the golden ratio and such, and the golden spiral that emerges. But there are others, and we'll talk about those at a later time. Okay, thank you for watching. And if you enjoy these videos, please let us know. Give us the thumbs up. And also, you're welcome to leave comments if there's anything that we could do to answer your questions or to support you in any way. And please basically sign up. Take care.